Hello and welcome everyone to this online session dedicated to media in the Arab countries. We are delighted to have managed to bring together a very special connection with three experts, Huda Abdel Hamid, Zahra Harb, and Adel Iskandar from Doha, London, and Vancouver. So, greetings to the three of them and to the audience from Madrid, from Casa Árabe in Madrid. We are going to talk about this 30 years since Desert Storm and a series of lights. You might remember a series of lights over a green background on CNN, a few reports on the rooftop of the Al Rashid Hotel in Baghdad. That's how many of us still remember that war. 30 years have passed since that first Gulf War, which has been described by many media observers as misleading and heavily restricted by the Pentagon's red lines. Surgical operations and collateral damage were new terms that were included in that war narrative. And despite the fact that live television broadcasts provided the viewer with minute-to-minute coverage of the developments of that conflict, that same immediacy, replete with sounds and pictures, did not facilitate comprehension, but instead made it more confusing. Here we have some images from a book called Persian Gulf, Scene of Never-Ending Conflicts. That's a recently published book by Iranian photojournalist Kaveh Kazemi, which probably helps complement the picture of that war. The ensuing U.S. Wars in the region have come and gone. Desert Fox provide comfort, Iraqi freedom in Iraq, scorched earth and blow the head in Yemen, unified protector with NATO in Libya, to name just a few. That's without counting the Israeli operations in Gaza, at least 10 of them since 2005, and one recently started days ago. Or just reward in Lebanon back in 2006. And then the foreign interventions of Arab states, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates taking the lead, have also added to the very complex map of interregional conflicts and civil wars, like the one in Syria being one of the most clear examples. We have some images as well of that harrowing conflict. Besides the quirky and often cruelly ironic names of these operations and their dire humanitarian consequences, what has the coverage of these conflicts meant for journalists, for audiences, and for the communication practices in media corporations? In the MENA region, even though the media landscape in the Arab world has changed dramatically since the end of the 20th century, characterized in particular by the creation of TV satellite channels and the emergence of the internet, there is still a huge gap between the expectations of these technology developments and the realities of Arab politics and societies. And of course, social media under its many channels have been embraced by the younger generations. We had the bloggers in the early days of the Arab Spring, now probably turned influencers on Instagram. Greater competition for audiences is now the norm, and some established news providers have felt under threat, which in turn has pushed boundaries and opened spaces, although there has also been backlash in many cases. Today, Casa Árabe has gathered three panelists to help us untangle so many of these questions. Allow me to welcome and to introduce them. Huda Abdel Hamid was hired as the Iraq correspondent and then became a senior international correspondent for Al Jazeera English. She was one of the main contributors to the channel's Arab Spring coverage in Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and Syria. She has also covered the Ukraine revolution in Kiev and then went on to Crimea and eastern Ukraine. Since 2014, she has been documenting the plight of migrants and refugees arriving in Europe. Previous to her current position, she worked with ABC News during Operation Desert Fox in 1998. She also covered the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the post-invasion sectarian conflict. She was also embedded with Allied forces in Anbar and Tikrit and she has won 3 Emmy Awards and an award at the Festival du Film de Monaco. She joins us from Doha. Thank you, Hoda. Also
Hi, everybody.
with us is Zahra Harb is director of the MA Master of Arts International Journalism and Media and Globalization programs at City University of London. Her publications include an edited collection titled Reporting the Middle East, the Practice of News in the 21st Century, and an edited collection with Dina Matar titled Narrating Conflict in the Middle East, Discourse, Image, and Communication Practices in Palestine and Lebanon. She has more than 11 years experience as a journalist in her native country, Lebanon, working for local and international media organizations, amongst them BBC Arabic Service, CNN, Dutch TV, as a news reporter, producer, and presenter. Zahra has also served as member to a UK broadcast regulator Ofcom Content Board between 2015 and 2018. She joins us from London. And Adil Iskandar, he's an assistant professor of global communication at Simon Fraser University in Canada. He's the author, co-author, and editor of several works, including Egypt in Flux, essays on an unfinished revolution, also Al Jazeera, the story of the network that is rattling governments and redefining modern journalism, Mediating the Arab Uprisings and Media Evolution on the Eve of the Arab Spring. Adil's work deals with media, identity, and politics, and his engaged participatory research includes supporting knowledge production through scholarly digital publishing such as Jadaliya. Prior to his arrival at SFU, Adil taught at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies and the Communication, Culture, and Technology program at Georgetown University in Washington. He is in Vancouver. So thank you all of you for being with us. This is really a stellar cast. We are very happy to have you on board. Let's start with the first segment on content. Let's believe that the battle for hearts and minds is won by imposing a narrative. An author, Paul Virgilio, said there is no war without representation. The content is essential in persuading and how to define the enemy as well. But also the content is definitely important in the way it's distributed across the waves. Zahra, you first. Give us a panoramic assessment of the major changes undergone in terms of content.
So thank you, Karim. Give a panoramic view is a very challenging thing to do, basically. And I just want to start with briefly just put 2 time frames to this. And my time frame would not start from the Desert Storm. It would start from 9/11. And there are two things that I want just to refer to here. One is the Western coverage, or mainly the Anglo-American coverage of the Middle East or the MENA region, and the coverage that we're seeing internally within Arab media itself. You know, the coverage has gone. It was tainted before 9/11. By an element of which basically one of my PhD students call an element of colonial narrative that has been dominating the coverage by Anglo-American media and mainly by American media of the MENA region. But after 9/11, that actually extended itself to also become a kind of like demonizing narrative towards Islam and Muslims in general. So it's not just about Arabs; it's also included or widened to include Muslims and Islam. And one of the things that actually kind of like tainted this whole coverage since 9/11 till our daytime till now is what we refer to in my book Reporting the Middle East is there's an element of prejudice, there's an element of ignorance in many cases, and also journalists actually kind of like feeling comfortable in their own stereotypical kind of like understanding of the other of a region that many of them actually haven't been to or have not communicated directly with people who live in it. to sort of making assumptions about certain aspects of its culture and people. I just want to give one example about, something that just happened 4 days ago when the BBC was actually not using its experienced correspondents on the ground to cover the protest in Jerusalem. So they made an in-house report on the protest, and in that report, the journalist who actually wrote the report said, or referred to Al-Aqsa Mosque complex as a revered site for Muslims. And in fact, it's a holy site for Muslims. So there's a difference between using a term revered and for something that billions of people see as holy, in a very kind of like sensitive, contested conflict that is escalating in a way or another. And again, for me, just looking at this type of coverage, and even if it is just like one word in a bigger kind of story, it basically kind of like show an element of either I'm sure it's an element of ignorance for a journalist who has no kind of like connection to the history or culture of that region to be actually working on this story. And I just also briefly, because I have 5 minutes to do this, what you call Karim panoramic. The Arab media, content has also changed, but the time frame for that, like the corner, time for that was January 11. So we're talking about 9/11, and then we're moving 10 years after that into January 11. And after the uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt, we started seeing actually a kind of like more, mainly in relation to pan-Arab channels in the region. We started seeing more kind of like these pan-Arab channels moving into cornering itself with the foreign policies of the countries that they are affiliated with. So we've seen Al Jazeera affiliating with the Qatari foreign policy. We've seen Al Arabiya affiliated with completely with the Saudi and Emirati foreign policies, and that has demonstrated itself in the coverage, and it has been growing and growing and manifested itself even severely when the deadlock between Saudi Arabia and Qatar took place. So politics within the Arab region have manifested itself in a very strong way in the content that has been produced by the two main pan-Arab channels, Al Jazeera and here I have just Huda to be also aware, when I talk about Al Jazeera in this context, I'm talking about Al Jazeera Arabic, because for some reason you're talking about the same network, but as if they actually, Al Jazeera English and Al Jazeera Arabic, they clearly see to come across as having two different editorial policies, and as if they actually don't belong to the same network when we're talking about the professionalism of how journalism is produced in both of these channels. So that's my brief panoramic introduction, Karim.
I'm sorry to have given you just 5 minutes. I know it's a very difficult task, but I'm sure we can go back to some of these issues later on, also during the Q&A. So let me move on to Adel. Adel, you have written a book on redefining modern journalism, and you have precisely taken the example of Al Jazeera. Why this medium, and how has this redefinition come about?
Well, thank you first and foremost, Karim, and everybody at Casa Arabi. It's a pleasure to be here, and delighted to be in the presence of both Zahra and Huda. I want to say that I want to also do what Zahra did and kind of cheat the system and kind of and rig the process by shifting the frame a little bit. I would say that the reason why Al Jazeera became a subject of debate and discussion when the book first came out in 2001, 2002 was shortly after the Intifada. Al-Aqsa, what was then called the Al-Aqsa Intifada. And then all eyes were on the Middle East post 9/11, as Zahra said. And so media and content being generated from the Middle East was considered a novelty. The global South, I mean, as we've typically grown accustomed to seeing the world, particularly from sort of continental Western European and North American lenses, the information travels from the global North to the global South, from the global West to the global East. But for the first time, we started seeing a substantial, well-funded network that has the gravitas to produce content and churn out a substantial amount of content, but also to be able to field journalists and reporters on the ground from conflict zones. And so that was the novelty that Al Jazeera was in 2001, 2002, and subsequently as the network grew and as Zahra explained, we started seeing a proliferation of that operation. But to take us back to the 30-year mark, which is the real topic of discussion here, is that Al Jazeera actually grew out of the milieu of Desert Storm, where for the first time we have live coverage of war. Now, of course, it is, as you described it in your very succinct and articulate introduction, it's definitely an excised and highly curated way of perceiving the conflict. It was really sort of what anthropologists would call sort of armchair anthropology. This was armchair journalism, to be on top of a building, videotaping or recording or streaming live. Now we use the word streaming to describe what we're doing today, but at the time, this was an absolute novelty, that conflict was being broadcast live into people's homes. But the lens itself was very much obfuscating, because you got to see those shimmering, kind of glowing green lights of Iraqi anti-aircraft missile trying to intercept the incredible barrage of what was then called carpet bombing, right? The carpet bombing of Baghdad, and all brought to you by reporters, who had an air of both responsibility and an air of authority. The Bernard Shaws, and I forget all the names at this point, it's been 30 years, but all these names became sort of central to our understanding of war reporting. Peter Arnett, those folks, they became kind of consecrated names associated with the coverage of conflict and war correspondency. And so with the Middle East, I mean, it should come as no surprise, but the Middle East, which had been embroiled at the time with a very substantial conflict between the Palestinians and Israelis, occupation of land, dispossession of communities, and wars between Israel and its neighbors, and of course, subsequently the wars and the embargoes against Iraq. I mean, all of those were begging local, national, regional coverage that represented the aspirations, the motivations, and the narratives and the contexts of those societies. And so it was at that juncture that Al Jazeera became both relevant and it was sort of like a perfect storm. I hate to use the word storm again. We're playing with the words. If we can kind of contort them and use them to our advantage, it became a perfect storm for Al Jazeera, that all of a sudden this network, also for all intents and purposes, bankrolled, supported, advocated for, funded by a regional government, which has its own sort of trappings, as Zahra said, its own implications, its own commitments. It basically tried to replicate what existed on CNN. At the time, it was called the CNN of the Arab world. So there's something, what happened 30 years ago with the coverage of the war in Iraq was then called the Gulf War, Desert Storm. There's so many different kind of euphemisms to describe it. A very destructive war. I mean, we have to say that the way it was presented was extremely sanitized. Al Jazeera tried to represent conflict and war in the region, whether it be in Iraq in 2003, as well as in Afghanistan in 2003, and the coverage of of Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the wars on Gaza, the war in Lebanon. I mean, so many different conflicts. The idea was to present conflict from the standpoint of the victims. And from there, we get into conversations about, well, what does objectivity mean? How is all of this presented? What does it mean to introduce context into coverage. So we began challenging this hyper kind of objectivist view of seeing the world, that there's one way to see the world, and that's it. So I think Al Jazeera was that kind of contribution, in the sense that when we say redefined modern journalism, the idea is that it interrupted the unidirectional flow of information. Now, of course, that is also 2001, 2002, 2003, and it's important for us to historicize and say, okay, things become more complex, things get more complicated, and we begin to learn more about these operations, the networks, the funders, the supporters, their political motivations, and all of those things. But at the very least, we begin to see the impact of live 24-hour news coverage with substantial kind of reporting and correspondency in a region that had been, for all intents and purposes, silent on the international scene, which is why Al Jazeera gets the attention that I think it deserves, for good or for bad.
Thank you, Adil, for this first introduction. And as you say, although that 30 years ago that Desert Storm had many traps, the fact is that it was the probably incubator of many other let's say ways to cover the region. And as such, you were pretty much saying that Al Jazeera was born out of that, and after that, many other outlets were inspired, I guess, also by this coverage, and by I think what you were saying, interrupting or changing the flow of information and having the global South become a protagonist. Now we're going to Hoda. Hoda. The first Gulf War had over 500 correspondents in Iraq, but only a handful were allowed in the front line. Peter Arnett, for example, as Adil was pointing out, in 2003, when you covered Iraq, there were, by the time, embedded journalists like yourself, seen by some this new way of being part or going with the army to the front line, seen by some as an advantage, but also as a factor that could jeopardize objectivity. You have been exposed as well to new devices that enhance and sharpen sight, infrared goggles for night vision, drones. How has the game changed for you as a reporter since that first Gulf War?
Well, oddly enough, I sort of started my career around the Desert Storm, so I wasn't much part of that one. Yeah, things have changed a lot on many levels. I just want to say that during the invasion of Iraq, I was not embedded. I was in Baghdad. I was embedded afterwards when they were looking for Saddam Hussein, the famous tightening of the noose. Now, yes, television has changed a great deal. If we're talking about, on all kinds of levels, the way you cover news, the technology, the content, the speed at which you are sort of pressured to bring out the news, and that can be extremely challenging and extremely stressful, because when you're on the ground, it's not only governments who have different narratives. When you're on the ground, different factions, different groups also have their different narratives and competing narratives. And your role as a journalist is to try to sort of bring in all of this, and to sift through that information that comes to you. Now, before social media, it was easier because you did it the old way. You picked up the phone, you spoke to people, you went down and you spoke to people on the street, you made appointments, etc. Now you're just bombarded with continuous feeds on your smartphone, or you have your newsroom calling saying, this person said that, this influencer said that, that website is saying that, and you sort of have to deal with the pressure of all this information coming, try to be quite strong and saying, no, I'm standing here in the field, this is what I see, and this is not true, and this is true. So you have that same dynamic that Zahra was talking about of obviously, finance their channels and eventually their foreign policy will come. You have that at a micro level on the ground with all these different groups competing also. They're also competing on who will get a video out as quick as possible, and then you have to make sure that that video is a real video. How many times, you had videos going viral that were basically of pictures, gruesome pictures of victims of another attack in another country. But with this continuous flow of pictures, it makes it extremely difficult. And then it makes it extremely difficult for the journalist itself because you're doomed to do a mistake. And when you do that mistake, all sorts of conspiracy theories come out. And sometimes it's just an honest mistake because of the flow of this continuous avalanche. I sort of try to shield myself from that, but it is an extremely difficult situation at the moment when it comes to covering war. If I look at the first conflicts I covered, whether it was in the Balkans or even Operation Desert Fox or the invasion, or you had two sides. It was quite conventional. Yes, obviously, if you were embedded with a particular army, that army wants to put out its own propaganda, its own PR machine. It wants you to see what it wants you to see, and it wants you to say what it wants you to say. But now the war is happening. It's very elusive. You don't know where's the enemy, where's he coming from. It's coming from above, it's coming from the side, it's coming from the smartphone, it's coming from everywhere. And it's a very different war that is still shaping up. The use of drones, the use of all sorts of new gadgets that appear at each conflict. I was in Azerbaijan and Armenia, Nagorno-Karabakh, at the end of last year. That was the first time I saw such a war. I would say it was all happening in the sky and causing an incredible amount of damage, and an incredible amount of human loss. So it is becoming, I think, more and more challenging for the journalists. And on the other side, I think the viewer has more and more sources of information, whether it's on TV or online. I think it's having more and more narratives. Both Adel and Zahra were talking about, the Anglo-Saxon, power or monopoly it nearly had on the world media for decades, and then Al Jazeera showed up. But then you also have other players on the ground. You have Russia Today, who has its own narrative, who has it in every single language. So you're always competing. People are always putting you on the spot, whether you're saying the truth, whether BBC is saying the truth, whether Russia Today is saying the truth. And at the end of the day, I think it's all different points of view that actually are non-mutually exclusive. But I think for the viewers, becoming more and more difficult to just kind of absorb all that information, all these opinions, and make his own opinion or her own opinion.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you very much, Hoda. I'm sure we will also come back to that duality or schizophrenia within your channel of what happens in the Arabic language versus what happens in the English language, or maybe you want to comment about how this, I know these are different audiences, therefore the information is processed differently, or the editorial guidelines change so much?
No, it's two different newsrooms. Al Jazeera Arabic is a regional channel that concentrates on regional news. Al Jazeera English covers intensely, for example, Africa, South America, Asia. It's heavily present. Its mission is a bit more global. Yes, of course, there's a big story in the Middle East. We do cover it, but our audience is different. The knowledge of the Middle East of our audience is different because most of our audience is outside of the Middle East. In the Middle East, they would watch channels in Arabic. So it's a different way of processing the information or presenting it to the audience.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to move to our second block about the consumption, the consumers of this content. We were talking that all these changes are wide and varied, and somehow these audiences are now craving for less parochial news coverage. The news is important to Arab populations, but the question of what constitutes now valued news has become more open as the choices are also wider to what is available out there. The press controlled by government, what we can call loyalist press, was the norm until the 1990s in the MENA region and up to the Arab Spring. After 2011, defying censorship was done mainly by individual activists who created their own news channels via, as I was saying at the beginning, blogging or microblogging. Social media sites also mushroomed on the internet. So was there a wider public for this content, or was it just aimed at the elites, Zahra Harb?
There's so many things that Adil and Huda said that I want to comment on, but I will probably leave it to later. But I think just talking about the content and mainly content that and also the kind of like media scene in the Arab world post the Arab uprising. And the role the social media networks played, in what I call mobilization of the groups of masses in several parts of the Arab world. Again, that has kind of developed in a way that governments have again come back. So governments in the region have made comebacks on controlling social media platforms, controlling that space, which we were all thinking that this is now the alternative space where the masses might be able to use in order to overcome the loyalist media that existed in several Arab countries. Few years after the Arab uprising, that proved not to be the case anymore. Simply, as I said, because the governments learned the lesson and they started mobilizing social media for their own purposes. And part of that is using trolls or electronic armies in order to, not just censor, but also pressure in cases in Egypt, for instance, journalists were forced to flee the country because of a massive campaign on social media that was targeting them and also putting them in their safety in danger. And it's still something that is still happening now. The question about social media getting or becoming kind of like a mass media platform, or is it still targeting the elite? The elite question has gone out of the equation now, simply because, and again, this is something that Arab Uprising has actually put forward. The level of penetration of internet in the Arab countries, and mainly in the countries where the uprisings took place in 2011, 2012, and 2013, has massively risen. The recent, I was just reading something just before we came, we started the discussion now. One of my colleagues at Oregon University he used to work on internet penetration and social media penetration in the MENA region. And his latest report actually showed that there is now around 181 million Facebook users in the MENA region in 2019. That's a massive number. We're talking, in his report, he talks about almost 50 million Facebook users in Egypt. And that has been achieved through, not through, desktops or laptops, or it has been achieved through mobile devices. So internet via mobile has allowed people from different, economic background to be able to join social networks and be part of that kind of like new new media comer on the scene, and social media platforms usage differs from one country to another. One of the things that also became very popular in for instance, in Kuwait is and in Saudi Arabia, in addition to Twitter, was WhatsApp. And in Qatar, it's the same. I'm familiar with, in Qatar, for instance, WhatsApp is used to conduct market, surveys. It's now identified in several Arab countries as one of social media networks, basically. So we've seen an uptake on social media penetration in different Arab countries, and it's not actually a medium just for the elite anymore. And it went through different changes, and one of the reasons why Facebook is more popular than Twitter is because Twitter took time for them to allow people actually to register and sign in Arabic. So the registration and sign-in process was in English, and not many, many people were able to do that. While Facebook early stages actually allowed its users to register and sign in their own native language, which also made Facebook more popular in several Arab countries than other social media platforms. We've seen now, like with the journalism, with the Jerusalem protest coverage, or basically follow on social media. We've seen an uptake in Snapchat, right? So it's become one of not Snapchat, Instagram. It's become one of the most popular platforms to basically disseminate activists and campaigners and ordinary people, their views on what's happening and their position in relation to what's happening. There has been, a debate a few days ago about the fact that Instagram is censoring hashtags with Jerusalem or Al-Aqsa in Arabic and in English, and that is due to the high, popularity and trending that these hashtags were having on Instagram. So, social media is still, has become a player, is still a player, but keep in mind that in many Arab countries, and mainly, for instance, in Egypt, TV is still the main source of news. So traditional media is still there, and I think it's going to be there for some time to come. And despite the fact that social media is taking its place in disseminating news, still traditional media in several Arab countries is the place that audiences and viewers, listeners go to in order to access news.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Zahra. Adel, your research or your current research is leading you to study the political role of memes and digital satire. So are audiences looking for shorter formats with more poignant messages? And were the Arab uprisings, in this sense, a watershed moment, a turning point?
Wow, Karim, you're traveling at such a fast pace. I'm still processing what Zahra said. Okay, I assure you I'll get to that point about memes. I just want to say, and I'll connect it in some way. I want to say that in sort of following up on what Zahra said, one of the real transformations that happened from 30 years ago and today has been, in addition to the existence of these platforms, these networks, these applications, we now went from being audiences, because for the most part, during the viewing of Desert Storm or the conflict on Iraq and Kuwait at the time, we were presumably somewhat passive in our reception of information, and we had very little to no input in or an ability to kind of deliberate over what was happening on our screens. Today, we are the content producers. Presumably, people who use social media platforms are themselves generating the content that becomes the news. And if we kind of zoom out a little bit and think about what has happened to the kind of the political economy of media and communications at large, we begin to realize that major Western networks or major private networks that are more interested in the bottom line and generating profit by keeping eyeballs on the screen have been struggling to justify foreign correspondency. There are fewer and fewer reporters traveling to various parts of the world to cover what is happening in those locales. So the alternative to that is to essentially utilize the content being generated by communities, by what was called in the early 2000s citizen journalism. Citizen journalism is just a shorthand for news organizations to essentially cast the net wider to be able to capitalize on what's being generated. So whether this content is coming through Facebook or coming through Instagram or being shared on YouTube, you'll remember that YouTube back in its early days had a slogan called "Broadcast Yourself." Today, people are posting Facebook lives. I mean, people are engaged, and in some instances, I'm even going to call it a business. The business of generating content has been relegated to or mandated to the masses. And then news organizations play the role of arbiters. They get to decide what they want on their airwaves and what they don't. So if you're an Israeli network today, you're going to pick up the content that's being generated by Israelis that affirm the state narrative. If you are a Palestinian, pro-Palestinian news organization, you're going to tap into the resources and the content being generated on social media in those realms. So for all intents and purposes, what we have today is sort of the co-option and the appropriation of content being generated by the masses, if you will, by the public at large, to the benefit of one political agenda or another, depending on the circumstances. Of course, that there are still facts on the ground, and there's still circumstance, there's still dehumanization, dispossession, but how those perspectives are engineered depends largely on who gets to call the shots of what ends up on the airwaves and what doesn't. But we also have changed as audiences in the sense that we are more inclined to get our information from curated and organized and sort of pre-selected material produced by, or I should say curated by, the people that we know on our social networks. The idea that we are going to sit down, turn on the TV, and watch CNN, Fox News, Al Jazeera, RT, BBC. I mean, there's a sort of an ageist argument there, but for the most part, people under the age of 35 are gravitating towards social media platforms, including their own networks, right? That reinforce their opinions. We expect and we try to hold news organizations to the high standard of meeting sort of professional journalistic mantras such as objectivity, or I mean, even if we don't believe that objectivity exists, which I don't, but nevertheless, like that it's a mirage that needs to be pursued. We try to hold news organizations to that standard. But on a fundamental level, as audiences, we typically look for the things that reaffirm and reinforce our pre-existing opinions. So, and that's how we organize the way we both internalize content and redistribute it through our networks. So the social networks have essentially served to reinforce the existence of echo chambers where we hear the things that we want to believe. And news organizations and sort of journalistic entities have to decide where they exist on that spectrum. So when Huda talks about Al Jazeera's different kind of editorial policies depending on the audiences that they're reaching, that is precisely it. You've got a Qatari-based news entity that produces content for the global South English-speaking audiences in India and in Pakistan, and diasporic communities in English in the West. And you've got a news organization that broadcasts to the Middle East in Arabic, and you've got other network like Rightly, for instance, their new online platform that's supposed to reach sort of right of center audiences and kind of millennials in the United States. All of those generated by the same news organization, or sports lovers through beIN Sports. So this kind of segmentation of the audience is precisely why news organizations are taking advantage of the echo chambers. They realize that audiences only care about context. And at the end of the day, they're going to be condemned for not being objective. So what's the point? So they've given up on objectivity and are just producing content that both affirms their political motivations whether it's through embedded reporting. And I'm sorry, I have to like take one extra second to say something about embedded reporting, because embedded reporting is, and Huda, I respect what you do, and it's not a condemnation of you, but the Defense Information School in the United States literally concocted the idea of embedded reporting specifically to undermine the discourses from the battlefield that promote perspectives on the victimization of casualties and civilians. So to control the narrative, you have to serve. I mean, you effectively become militarized precisely the way the military regiments are. So this is, a very clear way to excise and to eviscerate all perspectives and make this really about the military. And nobody does this better than the IDF. The IDF embeds reporters. That's the only narrative that needs to be seen. And the U.S. military has made that the only way to survive conflict. If you're part of the U.S., if the U.S. military is involved, you want to survive a conflict, you embed yourself with a military regiment. Otherwise, it's fair game. You might be a casualty as well. So, to avoid the risks of covering war, you embed yourself with one military regiment or another, so that you can seek protection and shelter while inadvertently producing and reproducing the narratives that support that military endeavor. So anyway, I'm belaboring the issue, but I think these are all part of how audiences are manufactured. I mean, that's the argument I'm trying to make, that audiences are manufactured to affirm and reaffirm specific political motivations and perspectives. And we, as audiences, are driven by our own personal motivations, but we are very easily the targets of misinformation, disinformation, and echo chambers that help us lose our ability to empathize with others as a consequence.
Mm-hmm. I understand this directly feeds into polarization of societies, the way you have described it, right, Adil?
Yes, and I have said nothing about memes. I apologize. That was really the least satirical intervention I could have made. But if I spent, I sure, can I say that for 30 seconds? So memes are a manifestation of political satire, where people basically vent their incapacitation in the face of what exists. And I think the sort of the fetish around virality, like everybody wants to be viral, news organizations want to be viral, everybody's producing things for distribution. And memes have a way of resonating with people in such a way that they can kind of laugh about their own circumstances, but at the same time, in many instances, also evade what Zahra described as whether it's the state's kind of oppressive tentacles and securitization of these platforms. A joke that is embedded in sort of linguistic kind of suggestive language or folklore, or some kind of cultural messaging that is too cryptic for communities that don't understand it to get. All of those are ways in which people can challenge both regimes, media, those in power, but memes are also produced to reinforce power. So it's a tool like any sort of weapon. It's a tool that can be used by anyone, both perpetrators and victims.
Thank you for coming back to the question. But you are also totally free to go outside the script. Do not worry. Hoda, I mean, you can, of course, just react to what Zahra and Adil have just been commenting on this segment. That I had just a question that you have somehow touched upon in your previous intervention, and it is related to the tasks that journalists are asked to perform, more and more duties to feed the monster. So do you feel more and more cornered to be a multimedia, multi-platform journalist who has to interact with audiences and also face competition from what Adil mentioned, citizen journalists? Maybe we don't use that term anymore, but it's still around there. And how does it affect the quality of your coverage or of your research, if you want?
Well, me, a bit of an old hack, so I do have very strong resistance towards social media. Uh, I do have a little presence. I don't feed it very much personally. I'm much more of a voyeur than a contributor when it comes to social media. But I do see the younger generations in the newsroom. They're definitely much more engaged, and I definitely know, the influencers and the people and all of that. They follow it much, much closer than I am, because from a generation when we started working in television. Basically, you either worked, for the likes of the BBC or any American network. CNN didn't even exist. So I'm from that generation. So it is, I find it difficult. I find it difficult to get this instinct of just jumping on my Twitter feed and immediately writing what I see or what I hear. I hesitate because I'm not used to it. I'm not used to divulge information immediately. I sort of have to process it. But I know that I am not the mainstream at the moment. I'm kind of this oddball, and I see what's happening around me, and certain yes, being on all these platforms and doing Instagram live and then getting questions from audience, all sorts of things are happening. So once in a while I'm told, okay, now you have to do it, but it doesn't come naturally. Now, I do want to comment on one of the things Adil just said about embedded journalists. It's true. I agree 100% that being embedded is basically playing into the propaganda of whoever you're embedded with, and the two main players being the American army, three main players. The British were also quite good at that during the invasion of Iraq and in Afghanistan, and the Israeli army. However, there are, first of all, there are many more journalists who are not embedded than those who are embedded, and who go to exactly the same places and who risk their lives and who do terrific works. And I think what we're ignoring in this conversation so far is the fixers. The fixers are better than any social media you can ever imagine. There is not one journalist, whether it's print, radio, TV, even those who are continuously on their Twitter feed, who don't have fixers, who are the eyes and ears on the ground of what is happening, who give you the real picture, who send you videos, who give you quotes. These people are completely overlooked, and they feed all these beasts we've been talking about. And they are really the unsung hero of modern journalism. Now, when you go to be embedded, yes, of course, they want to control your narrative, and that's why they're accepting embedded in the first place. And most of the time, American military doesn't really like when you have foreign media coming along. They're coming in to bring their own media to feed their own propaganda to their own domestic audience. The same with the Brits, the same with the Israelis. I mean, there's no way on earth that an Israeli army would take me embedded with them. I don't think it would ever happen. Fine, yes. But on the other side, if you're a journalist, you go, you know your limitations while you're there, but then you get to see also things that you wouldn't see otherwise. You get to see the other side of the story beyond that front line. You're standing on one front line. You get to see what's on the other side, and it could be helpful for you to understand the whole picture. I mean, yes, the person you're going to interview is going to give you his lines, but you have eyes and ears to see and all what's going around. So it is, for me, I mean, the few times I was embedded, I actually did learn beyond. I went to areas in Iraq, in Al-Anbar, let's say. I could have never gone alone. I would have been kidnapped, or who knows what would have happened, because it was so dangerous. It wasn't dangerous for me, it was dangerous for every single human being going in those areas. So I do have mixed feelings about it. I think you can make something out of it, as far as my experience. Okay, I'm just speaking on my experience. What I find these days more difficult is trying really, I don't even know if I know how to explain it. back to Israel, and hopefully eventually I'll go into Gaza. What I find difficult is finding a way these days when what we're described as mainstream journalists, we're completely under attack at the moment. Our credibility is always been put into suspicion, of finding a way of telling the story and keeping it relevant for the viewer. I think there's a huge fatigue in general when it comes especially to stories coming out of the Middle East for an international audience. It's complicated, and there's also that attitude, yes, it's against them fighting. And I've noticed that that has been a constant in my career, where people always tell me, why do you keep on going there? I'm like, because it's happening, because you need to continue buying it, because people are dying, because people are suffering. And I find that the audience is less and less interest, even less. And there was a moment of compassion. That compassion is gone at the moment. And they're listening to all these different narratives, and they don't know what to think anymore. They don't know what. So these labels that get given. And I find it's very difficult at the moment for journalists to tell a story without somehow make abstraction from the fact you're under constant attack because you work for this network, because you're considered a mainstream journalist, because each time you open your mouth, you're going to be, someone is going to suspect something of you. And I find it's really hard. I see it on reactions on social media, as you guys say, the insults you get, the praises you get about exactly the same word. So I think it's extremely difficult at the moment.
Thank you, Hoda.
Yeah,
I think this ties in very well with what the segmentation that Adil mentioned earlier of audience and those echo chambers. Yes, Zahra, please go ahead.
I just want to comment on the embed bit, and I agree with Huda, and I agree with Huda simply because we've actually, I was part of a research that we conducted when I was at Cardiff School of Journalism in 2003, 2004, and we interviewed embed journalists, journalists who were embedded with the American Army and journalists who were embedded with the British Army. And they literally said what Huda has just said now about the fact that it was an opportunity for them just to access, the front lines that they will not been able to access if they were not embedded with the military. I think what we discovered in our research, the fact is, the problem with some of that coverage come from the fact that some of the journalists were not making clear to their audiences that what they are actually, the information that they are giving them is information that they have either got from the army or have seen because they are embedded with the army. So it's the idea of attribution that we have found problems with. Journalists who were embedded were not actually attributing their sources to the military. So, many of them would just present what they had as if it's something that they have witnessed rather than something that they were told by the military. And some journalists were really good at doing that. And this is where we found the difference between different journalists actually doing the same kind of coverage. And the other problem we found is the idea, the lack of accuracy, if you want to call it, has actually come not from the journalists embedded with the army. It came from headquarters. It came from either London or whatever the organization headquarters is by editors, by presenters who were asking wrong questions, who were making assumptions. So one of the findings of this research was basically that the BBC has made major mistake by adopting the fact that there was weapons of mass destruction. And it was a simple error of not attributing that to the military. So, or the, British government also saying that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. But they were not attributed, where is your source? Attributed to the source you got it from. And that's the problem that they have faced later. And they admitted that that was an error in their, journalistic judgment that they have done in that coverage. The other thing that I want to, just comment on also what Huda was mentioning. What we need now from what Huda called mainstream journalists, because they are still followed by audiences and users, right? Is to process the information before they post. So this is one of the issues. I've been working with journalists in several countries in the region and outside the region. And one of the problems that we're having, for instance, with hate speech, with disinformation, is that because of journalists and mainstream journalists, tendency to jump into the clickbait. I need more followers. I need more people to follow. I need more people to share. So if I'm quick in posting, then that will generate more clicks, will generate more followers, will generate more posts. But in many cases, and working with journalists, some of the things that they jump to post is actually inaccurate. But because they don't do that processing of the information before they, don't rush, think. That's the difference between the mainstream journalist and what I call professional journalist, and someone who is claiming to be a journalist. And I think we really need to keep pressing on that fact. This is what differentiates professional journalists from journalists who are, amateur or claiming to be journalists under the auspices of citizen journalists. That's my.
May I say something just to add to what Zahra is saying? I think that I don't want to sound old again, but that's the reality. The younger generation is under much more stress about having followers. That's how they're going to get a decent job offer. That's how they're going to be poached from one broadcaster to another, from one media out to another. So, and I think that's also part of the issue here. There is a competition. You need to have followers. It's part of your job these days. It's part of your identity as a journalist. And it leads to a lot of mistakes. It does. With the speed of it, it does lead to a lot of mistakes because it's constant. It's constant, and you're in the field, and you have to do your live. You have to film. You have to deal with the danger around you. You have to post. You have to do a gazillion things. That is a perfect storm to do mistakes, that then cost a lot, not only to that person, to the entire network. It can, in some areas, in the Middle East, for example, not only, I would say in other conflict zones, tempers are high, emotions are high, people read a tweet, it can lead to reactions. It is, I mean, it needs to be processed. I agree with Zahra 100%. How is, I don't know. Will it get even quicker? I don't know, but that's something that kind of scares me for the future of journalism.
Adil, did you raise your finger?
Yes.
Yes,
just
go
one
ahead.
finger.
I like the finger, Adil.
No, I just want to say that I don't want to be misconstrued. I know I sounded quite spirited in my critique of embedded journalism, and I wanted to sort of point out that my critique is a structural critique. Rather than a critique of journalists. I mean, journalists are, I mean, as both Huda and Zahra described, they struggle with circumstances where access to information is extremely complicated. And I think that, states, governments, and the military more specifically are creating structural circumstances where accessing locales, accessing information becomes the dominion of those who agree to be in those spaces. And the alternatives are quite dire and very complicated. So this is not in any way a critique or a condemnation of journalists who are, as Huda described now, they're stretched extremely thin. They have to not only acquiesce to so many sort of pressures. They have to communicate with fixers, as you said, Huda. They are indeed the unsung heroes, and they are really the connection. They're all the senses, really, of journalists who are doing the reporting. But then they also are the ones who get critiqued when the information is presented and it isn't up to snuff, depending on where audiences are approaching this from. And as Zahra said, the study that Zahra is describing on embedded reporting is a fantastic work. It has to be, anybody who's interested in embedded reporting should read that study, because it is the purview of journalists who are in those circumstances, and they are the ones kind of reflecting about their practice. So it is not the journalist that I'm critiquing, for all intents and purposes. It is about controlling the messaging, and we can go back. We can rewind even before embedded reporting to the time when the only way to actually tell the story of war, let's say the First World War, Second World War, Korea, Vietnam, the only reporting that existed at the time was literally war correspondency. War correspondents have been embedded for decades, hundreds of years, arguably, and that is why the victors are the ones who typically tell the story. It's more of a critique of the structural circumstances that have made embedded reporting such an important part of the storytelling around the conflict. Where in reality, it would be great for all of us to be able to piece together this puzzle and say, all right, so this is the perspective of the U.S. military as relayed through this reporting. This is how it all comes together. But because the way we access information is so incredibly disjointed, it becomes extremely difficult for us to see the big picture. The big picture is the product of that segmentation. And I just want to resort to something that the late Palestinian American literary critic Edward Said described on the issue of representation. He often described the importance of shifting the narrative, shifting representation, but he also described representation as an extremely violent action, because when you represent, you inadvertently accept that something is going to be outside the frame. So the moment that you capture something, you are actually, in a very violent way, excising and cutting out something. And that process of exclusion, inadvertently, right, both eliminates what exists on the sidelines. The blind spots are huge, and you miss the opportunity to intervene. The problem with reporting and the speed at which all of this is happening, the expediency, and as Zahra and Huda both described, the inability to process, analyze, and do things in time, because you're dying to get that scoop. You're literally, in some cases, dying. A lot of journalists do die to get the scoop, which is horrifying to think about. You inadvertently miss the opportunity to provide context, to verify, in fact, some information, which further hurts both the industry at large, journalists specifically, and everyone else, because now we've got skepticism, media skepticism everywhere. You've got Trump supporters in the United States questioning whether or not there's truth. Is there a truth in journalism at all? There's nothing real. Nothing is functional or tangible, as we begin to see this complete kind of collapse of reason. And reporters inadvertently, Huda's work is really fantastic, but you should see the way Huda's work is taken out of context to serve different agendas, right? You're lucky, Huda, that you're not spending so much time on social media. All of a sudden, one of her reports will get chopped up into little pieces and turn into something else, and then you see it 5 or 6 generations later, and it's here it is justifying X or justifying Y. No, I don't want that, So this is the world that we're living in, where the news cycle is expedited. It is so fast, we can barely keep up, and the inability to tell the story or to kind of capture the realities at the moment that it is happening, right? When we recognize that there are no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, right? At the outset, it misses the opportunity to intervene into political narrative. It becomes, it's almost like the temporality changes. So we can think back and say, oh, you remember when the Iraq war happened and there were no weapons of mass destruction? Well, too late now. You've got 500,000 people displaced, hundreds of thousands of people killed, a country that has been that's disintegrated on the grounds of a false premise that was only proven after the fact. And that's the point. I think it's important for things to happen if people are consuming news in real time, then the context has to be in real time. Then the news verification has to be in real time, and that's a lot of pressure on journalists. And that is why my critique is a critique of the structure that makes all of this so complicated. But journalists, as we say in the Arab world, ala rasi, they're doing everything that they can, right?
But may I also add that, I mean, I was saying that at the beginning, it's also in some places become very dangerous just to be a journalist. I mean, how many times we've seen, probably since Fallujah, journalists becoming the story, journalists wearing orange suits and losing their lives in the most gruesome ways. So when you're underground, lately, and when with this proliferation of weapons everywhere and militia groups, and you don't know who's who, you also sort of, even if you're not embedded, sometimes just watch out what you're going to say, at least while you're in the country and underground. I'm the correspondent. I go on there and speak. If I do something wrong, I'm putting at risk an entire team behind me. I'm putting at risk the camera, the fixer, the driver. It's a lot of pressure. And lately, journalists have been threatened more and more underground with weapons, with beheadings, with rape, with all sorts of things. So that is also another thing that we have to put into context when we're reporting, because at the end of the day, we're also human beings. So, and I mean, I couldn't live with myself if I say something wrong that would cause someone to lose its life. And I've been in a few situations where it's been extremely hairy, and alhamdulillah, nothing, extreme happened, but it makes you think. It makes you rethink the way you work. It makes you rethink how you're going to do a story while you're underground, and maybe take some footage and do it differently when you leave. You have to put all that into consideration. It's uglier and uglier out there on the ground, and it's not easy, honestly. That's another thing. And so the viewer sees that why is she not saying this? Why is she not doing this? Well, around me, there's a lot of other things that I can't say because, again, it will put danger on us. And I have to take into consideration to try to do the best job possible with what I have there. It has to be taken into consideration. I think it's very important.
And if I might say, this is where social media becomes a very dangerous tool in the hands of audiences, simply because now they can interact, which is something that we hailed at the beginning of it. Like, now audiences can interact with journalists, can interact with media organizations, so their voices are heard. That can actually have an impact on the way content is produced. But on the other hand, having that weapon and I would call it, like, sometimes it's a very dangerous weapon in hands of audiences, means that it becomes a tool of abuse and jeopardize journalists' safety.
Well, I mean, Adel just said that, I don't know, some pieces were cut to some of my reports were cut to pieces. Thank God I didn't see that. Thank God I'm not on social media. It makes me the idea makes me shriek, because then sometimes you get these insults on your Twitter feed and you have no clue what brought this about, and it's probably what you're talking about.
Well, I think definitely the factor that social media can be such a manipulative instrument or tool in the face of conflict and polarization is a clear reality. We have seen it not only in elections in the United States or with the Brexit campaign, but we see it every day, not only in the Middle East but in Latin America, and it is really scary. And as you say, Hoda, you also have somehow this affects the way you decide or you cover a sensitive issue, and you might have to self-censor yourself because it's a delicate matter, at least whilst you're in that country. Let me move to our last.
Sorry. sorry, just more than
Yes.
self-centering is using the proper
The right.
wording. The wording. Just think about every word you're gonna say. I think more than
Yes,
self-centering.
Can I just say, I actually struggle with that as an academic, okay, giving public talks. So imagine how journalists actually can, mainly if it is to do with conflict like the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, for instance, or something to do with, say, Egypt, or basically, sensitive contexts where, even as an academic, and sometimes I just give, interviews to mainstream media, I have to be careful in every single word I use. So imagine how journalists are struggling with that. I don't envy you, Huda.
My final sort of like segment was on the media divides, about the disparities within Arab countries in respect of the availability or accessibility of media among their citizens. Zahra has spoken about Facebook and why it reaches more audiences than other media. She has also spoken about the way traditional media still is more imposing in many contexts. But these digital divides exist based on hierarchical social and economic structures, on income status as well, on educational and literacy, education level as well. And this in turn can create further media divides. This is not only true, of course, in the MENA region, but in the rest of the world. And this year's World Press Freedom Day in UNESCO, the main subject was information as a public good. It was a call to affirm the importance of cherishing information as a public good and exploring what can be done in the production, distribution, and reception of content to strengthen journalism and to advance transparency and empowerment while leaving no one behind. So we have all this. We've been speaking about all these TV platforms, satellite, and the social media, the speed at which they have also been embraced by Arab people. And this is posing also threats to the authoritarian control of the governments. I don't know, Hoda, you have been in places where the coverage of the Arab Spring became a very sensitive issue. We're talking about how to voice and a specific content under certain circumstances. So I don't know if this is something that this media divides, you have seen it, or you can appreciate how different audiences have access to your content, to your messages.
I have to say that once you're in, it's during the Arab Spring specifically, you were at a time in countries where the internet was down or had been cut off, or communications were very difficult. So you kind of were a bit. I'm thinking specifically, for example, about Libya, unaware about all the noise that's going around. But Adel, in one of his answers earlier, said that people will follow or will listen, and I think will also watch a channel or listen to radios, to what they know, to people they can relate to the same kind of thinking. So I think that divides exist already within each individual. If you are a liberal, you're not going to watch certain channels, or you're not going to follow certain people. If you are a conservative, you're not going to certainly watch, the young bloggers, or, the Wa'al Ghunaim or the whatever. For example, in Egypt, it really, I think people from the beginning make already their own choices instinctively somehow. Or I don't know if you guys agree with me.
Adil?
Sorry, I had to reach for the unmute button. Yes, no, I absolutely agree with what Hoda's saying. I think in addition to Karim, you mentioned the digital divides. I think we also have narrative divides. where people are choosing the discourse that meets their criteria for what constitutes reality. And the more they dig their sort of heels and become more rooted in a particular narrative, the less likely they will be open to the possibility of exploring something else. And incidentally, not just networks, meaning television and online sort of communities, but the curation becomes more and more succinct at giving people what they want in that sense. So you begin to see communities come together, whether it's on Facebook or Instagram or on all these different platforms, so they can, manufacture, produce, and recycle content that reaffirm their status quo. And that's really kind of where we are going. But that also doesn't mean that we are past the point where we're talking about digital divides. We still have countries in the Middle East and North Africa where, literacy rates are less than 50%, and that's a problem. And it means that despite the existence of the mobile technology, these communities may have, as the UNESCO kind of World Press Day, discussion about information and public good is about. But really, there's another problem, which is the absence of their ability to be knowledge producers. This whole point about whether or not we as communities, as individuals, are capable of contributing to the discourse. Well, if we are on the other side of that digital divide, that we can't really contribute. We can't really have a voice in this wider discussion. And if the objective is to have more voices and more sort of a plurality of different kind of perspectives, then we are actually being hurt by both the echo chambers and by the digital divide. It's almost like they come together to make it more difficult for us to explore and hear perspectives that are different from our own. Which brings us to the issue of what role does journalism play? If journalism is responsible for just giving us what we want, sort of a consumerist kind of commodity that is driven by what audiences want, then what does it mean to be a professional journalist in the year 2021, right? If all we want is what we expect from a news organization. That I think is the struggle that kind of is the elephant in the room. How do you produce journalism in 2021 if all people want are exactly what they want? And then it's almost like walking into a grocery store. And with the proliferation of networks and platforms and communities and people producing different things, before you know it, it's like walking into a grocery store and picking a cereal box. That's how news is becoming, unfortunately. And I would argue that it gets even worse from when you look at it in terms of the political economic kind of approach, because now there's, like we've always talked about, the conglomerization of media. Those who really hold the reins of the media around the world are still a numbered few. Even when we look at specific countries, in the Arab world, for instance, we have now media moguls. These media moguls are wealthy individuals who are connected to local regimes or are connected to local monarchies, and they are basically responsible for our daily news diet. How communities manage it may be something different, but really I think we're dealing with kind of a neoliberal authoritarianism of the media in the Middle East specifically, but I would say that it's even more so, or I would say in places where the public media is essentially collapsed, and we have the rise of private media. Private media are chasing clickbait exactly like journalists, perhaps more so, because that's their bottom line. Their attempt to generate profit on the heels of this content is the real driving force. And so before you know it, we become commodities, the news becomes a commodity, everything is bought and sold, and then the public interest that UNESCO is trying to advocate for is kind of lost in the fray. So a very pessimistic kind of description, but that's sort of the way I see it, that there's like a neoliberal authoritarianism in the global media system, but even more so in the Middle East.
A final word from Zahra, who will give us some optimism, of course.
Yes. because I'm always trying to tell my students that this is not the future of journalism, and that's not the journalism that we want to be doing. But unfortunately, Adil is right, because I actually had one of my guest speakers talking about the title of his talk was Old News, Young Views. And he was talking about basically how now he's been consulted by many giant media organization in order to establish that system of a grocery, where audiences or consumers, as they call them, can come and pick the type of news they want to watch, or they want to listen, or they want to read. So you're not giving them one section, one news program. You're giving them sections, and each section will actually be covering certain type of stories. And audiences or listeners or readers can pick and choose, any of these stories, which I was totally against. So there was a heated debate in that talk. But I think I think that there's still hope in journalism. I think, and mainly if we still say that public service journalism and public service media is essential for the life of informative journalism that help promote and develop societies and keep democracy in shape. With the existence of public service media, I think we can still achieve that. I teach journalism students who are in their 20s, right? And they were kind of like completely taken by this approach of I want to give the audience what they want, and they were they were fighting back, like, this is not the journalism we're signing up for. Which I was happy with, and I think this kind of like enthusiastic future journalist is what keeping me feeling that it's not doomsday yet for journalism, or for public service journalism at least.
Thank you. We have a few more days before doomsday. I am gonna leave it here. Thank you very much. I know Hoda has to go in a very few minutes, almost, to the airport and catch a plane to report on the Gaza and crisis. So good luck with that. Please take good care. I know, we at least know that you will not be embedded with the IDF, which is very good news. And I'm very thankful to Adil Iskandar and Zahra Harb connecting from London, from Vancouver and London respectively. It's been extremely useful and pleasurable to listen to you. Adil, I like the use of your words and your unintended and intended puns as well. And thank you very much. I think this has given us a very good overview, both theoretically and practically, of the Arab media landscape and its interactions also with the West. So thank you very much, and also to the audience that is listening, and we'll hope to catch up again with you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karim.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Ma salama.
Bye.